So now I want to introduce our speaker. We're very happy to have Dr. Eden King here today. And I'm going to read her bio to you. Dr. Eden King is an associate professor of industrial organizational psychology at Rice University and the president-elect for the Society of IO Psychology. Dr. King is pursuing a program of research that seeks to guide the equitable and effective management of diverse organizations. This research has yielded over 100 scholarly publications and has been featured in the New York Times, Good Morning America, and the Harvard Business Review. In addition to her scholarship, Dr. King has consulted on applied projects related to climate initiatives, selection systems, and diversity training programs. She also published a book entitled How Women Can Make It Work, The Science of Success. And it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. King to the podium.
Good morning, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here with y'all, and I really hope that in the next little bit of time, you learn something that you didn't already know, maybe get inspired a little bit about your own lives, and or think about the ways that we might be able to help the people who we work with every day. So, as was suggested, I am an industrial organizational psychologist, so that means I study people and organizations. And my expertise, as you heard, is on diversity in organizations. And I am excited to talk to you about work that's come not just from my lab, but from the broader social science literature. We like to think of ourselves not just as psychologists, but also as scientists, as people who can contribute to the knowledge and understanding of people and work. And here I want to focus on the vast body of evidence that we've generated that can tell us some really important things about women's experience in leadership positions. I want to start with a bit of an orientation to my view of this topic. How many of you have heard of the glass ceiling? Okay. Has anyone heard of the labyrinth? Okay. What about the maternal wall? Okay. Glass cliff? Okay, so those are all metaphors that have been used to describe women's experiences in organizations. And in many ways, and in very different avenues, scholars have tried to understand each of those sort of aspects or ways of understanding women's experience. For me, I was inspired by a game I was playing with my daughter a few weeks ago. It was Chutes and Ladders. Do you remember that one? Okay. So in this game, what happens is the players start at the same square. And then based on a roll of the dice or of the little spinner, you get to move a certain number of squares forward, and you're trying to get quite literally to the top of the board. And on the way, you may encounter a ladder that helps propel you more quickly to the top. Or you might encounter a chute, which shovels you back down to the bottom. And there's one really nasty one that really takes you from almost at the top all the way back down to the bottom. And my daughter is competitive, and she is so frustrated when she gets that chute that she quite literally growls. She's almost 8, but she growls. She's so frustrated. Ugh! She can't stand that experience. And to me, this experience that I watched my daughter have is not so different from the one that we know that women are encountering in organizations. They start, our evidence tells us, at pretty much the same spot, the same square on the board. Women have about the same amount of what we would call human capital that they bring to organizations. They have similar levels of education. They have similar levels of experience. And even holding all those things constant, we know that women are less likely to be, when we hold all those things constant, we know that men and women are actually being hired at the same rates in most organizations. So when you start at the bottom square, we really are, to some extent, on equal footing. We're getting in the door. However, as we try to move up the board or through the labyrinth or through the glass wall, we encounter different experiences that sometimes help us move forward, as do the ladders, or shuttle us back down to that square one, as do the chutes. So I want to talk to you about what I have seen from the literature as both the chutes and the ladders. So I'm going to start with the problems. I'm going to argue, based on the research that we've done and that I've read, that women are overlooked, unheard, excluded, and protected. And I'm going to argue that each of those things, even the protection, can be problematic. So let's start with being overlooked. When you look at a table, a regular conference table, probably like ones you have in the offices where you work, we often ascribe power and status to the person who's at the head of the table. And researchers have studied precisely this phenomenon. If I showed you a picture right now of a conference room table, and pictured at the head was a man, and pictured all around the table were other men, you would assume that the man at the head of the table was the leader. That cue of being at the head of the table conveys status with it, leadership status. If at that same table it was all men and a woman was at the head of the table, you would be less likely, we as people would be less likely to assume that she was the leader of that group. We do not ascribe the same status to a woman given the same cue as we do to a man. Why? Our stereotypes. Our stereotypes get in the way. Stereotypes are cognitive representations. They're structures in the brain, schema, that help us understand the world in which we live. And they tell us, accurately, that women are less likely to be leaders than men. That is true. We know that. Our stereotypes are not generally, in that sense, inaccurate. However, when we apply that stereotype to any situation that we walk into, we often make errors. So if our stereotypes get in the way of our ascribing a leadership role to a woman at the head of the table, as we know they do, then that is bias in action. So that one of the findings from the research literature is that women are not given the same credit as men in the same positions. We also know that when women are in leadership positions, people respond to them differently. Again, stereotypes get in the way, and they affect our behavior. So in this case, I want to tell you about a study where researchers looked to see how people responded to male and female leaders. So they brought people into the lab, and they told them that they were going to be on a group task, and they told them that this one person had been chosen as the leader, and that person was either a man or a woman. And that person was actually not another participant, but was a researcher in disguise, a Confederate. And that individual was trained to act in exactly the same way. So all leaders acted exactly the same. But it turned out that their followers responded to them differently. So given exactly the same leadership behavior, your followers will respond to you differently if you're a man than if you're a woman. And in particular, what they saw was that the male leader got more positive nonverbal feedback than the female leader. The female got more negative nonverbal feedback. And I show this, I try to introduce this idea and this experience to my students in my psychology of gender class by having a kind volunteer come down to the front and experience what it feels like when everybody in the room is looking at you like you're crazy, and they're kind of giving you like a frown, and they're like, what are you talking about? And then I also do the opposite, where I have a student come down and experience what it feels like when people are nodding and smiling and are really engaged, leaning toward you. These are subtle behaviors, but they make all the difference. And if you think about yourself in your first leadership role, if everybody in the room was looking at you like you're crazy, was furrowing their brow, was trying to lean back, was like, what are you talking about? Versus if somebody is nodding and smiling and giving you positive feedback, that has a real impact on your interest in being in a leadership role again. Yeah, the student volunteers never want to do it again. They both get big cheers at the end. But this is also the case in organizations where women are getting these negative nonverbal reactions when they're in leadership roles, and men are getting the positive ones. It's not an overt behavior, it's subtle stuff, but that subtle stuff makes a huge difference. It also perpetuates some behavioral differences in how people are engaging as leaders. So these are part of the issues. Another experience that many women report is that of being unheard in meetings. You may have heard of this sort of idea, and Adam Grant and Sheryl Sandberg have written about it in the New York Times. You're in a meeting, and somebody makes an idea, says, oh, here, I have a suggestion for how to solve that problem. And what happens often, and the research confirms this, is that if that person is a woman, it's less likely to be heard. People are less likely to recognize it and respond to it than if that person is a man. And if later in the conversation the same idea comes back and it's made by a man, it's more likely to be received by the group. So this is the idea like, hey, I just said that 5 minutes ago, and now they think it's a good idea when somebody else says it. That is one of the most common experiences that women report, a very subtle phenomenon. It happened to me the other day, and I didn't know what to do about it because somebody basically took credit for an idea that I had, and it was kind of a dumb idea. It wasn't a big deal, so I didn't really do much about it. But it was a perfect example of how, hey, that was actually my idea, and they just took credit for it. One of the things that we know we can do to support each other is to call that out when it happens. So if you hear it in a meeting, you can say, hey, that was a great idea when so-and-so had it. Create some humor. Yeah, thank you, laugh, yes. It doesn't have to be confrontational in a sort of negative sense, but it does call attention to the behavior and the fact that the credit was due elsewhere. So I think this is an example of how people, but particularly in this discussion, women, can be unheard, and it can create real challenges for their success in organizations. Another one of the shoots that might make women want to growl is being excluded. And if you think about the term, the good old boys network, that came from a real place, a real experience where women were quite literally, purposefully excluded from situations in which work may or may not be involved. So the original sort of ideas were around like the golf course, right? And how white men would go play golf together on the weekends, and that's how their networks would form, and that would help them in their organizations. Well, it's very, very true that your social networks, not social networking, but your social networks absolutely have a relationship with your advancement in organizations. They have a relationship with your annual reviews. They have a relationship with salaries. They have a relationship with performance-based pay. They have a relationship with promotions. So when I'm talking about networks, I want to talk about the ways that researchers have often studied them. And what we typically do is ask, so if I were interested in the social network in this room, I would ask each of you to tell me, who do you go to when you have a problem? Who do you go to get your work done? Who do you go to for advice about non-work related activities? I could ask about different kinds of network relationships. I would also ask that of everyone else in the room. So I would get a sense of the people who are most important for each of those functions. And sometimes we actually ask, we say, to what extent do you like that person? To what extent do you like that person? To what extent do you like that person and that one? We can ask about all of you and what you think about all of each other. And so it becomes this huge data, beautiful mess. And what we know about the way that those networks work is that there are persistent and consistent gender differences. So one of the things that we know as being really important for positive organizational outcomes like promotions is that being central in a network, being at the middle of it, being the person that everybody goes to get their work done or for advice, that is highly correlated with advancement over time. So being in a central network position helps you. Women are less likely to be in those positions when it comes to work-related activities. Another thing that we know that is helpful when it comes to networks is being connected to people with power. So it's not just that you go to so-and-so for advice, but that so-and-so actually has power. Usually it's measured in our studies by hierarchical power. So are they a senior vice president, or are they a general manager, or where are they in the organizational chart? Are they at the hierarchies, the highest levels of the hierarchies, or are they at a lower level? And there too, what we find is that people who are connected to individuals at higher levels of the organization are more likely to be promoted. And there too we find women are less likely to have those connections. Women have stronger, on the other hand, women have stronger connections to a variety of people that around psychosocial or emotional sort of relationships. So women do tend to have stronger emotional or relational ties with others in their organizations than men, but those are not the ones that facilitate advancement. So for women who want to advance, they are being quite literally excluded in sometimes explicit ways like on the golf course, but also in some less obvious ways in terms of how people communicate with one another. We're studying social networks now looking at email trace patterns. So we would look at a week in the life of an organization and who is emailing who is responding to. We're not looking at any of the content of the emails, don't worry. It's really just, is person A talking to person B, talking to person C? And when person A emails person B, does person B email them back? And you can learn a lot about how people are communicating and who has power if you look at those. Because do you ever not respond to your boss's email? No. But do you sometimes ignore or take longer to reply to someone who's at a different level? Maybe. So we can look at those dynamics and really get a sense of who's talking to who, and we can see gendered patterns whereby women are not having access to the powerful people in their organizations. So women are excluded. In our own research in our lab, we've looked at a phenomenon that I would broadly call protection. And this is based on the idea, a form of sexism that's called benevolent sexism. And the ideology underlying benevolent sexism is that women are the mothers of our children and our own mothers, and they need protection, and they should be revered and put on a pedestal. And these ideas about women are part of what underlies traditions like chivalry and tendencies to open the door for women by men. And these notions are not on their face, negative, right? These are benevolent, positive ideas. Our argument is that when those sorts of behaviors are unwanted or inappropriate, as in the context of work, it can actually undermine women's success. And we've looked at this in a variety of ways. In one study, we were interested in whether these ideas about protecting women could influence the developmental opportunities that they have. And we noted in the literature that women do tend to have similar numbers of developmental opportunities. So if you ask men and women at the end of the year, how many training programs did you attend? How many workshops did you go to? How many different kinds of experiences did you have? They report about the same number. But we also found in our research that the nature of those experiences, those developmental opportunities, was quite different. For men, they reported higher levels of challenge, being challenged in those experiences than the women did. The developmental opportunities that women reported, they characterized as lower in challenge. And this included in a healthcare organization and an oil and gas organization. So women reported having less challenge than men. Why is that important? If you want to advance in an organization, you must be challenged. To learn new knowledge, skills, and abilities, you have to stretch, right? That's why they're called stretch assignments. You have to be challenged. You have to learn something new. It's a challenge. And so if women are having less access to those challenging experiences, then they might not be eligible for or appropriate for higher levels of responsibility. We also wanted to make sure that this was not something, this tendency for women to get less challenging experiences was not due to the behavior of the women themselves. So we asked women, well, how much do you want these kinds of challenging experiences? And we asked men the same thing, and they said the same amount. They both wanted the challenge. They were up for it. Everybody was up for it. We also were interested in whether or not there was a causal relationship, whether or not we could say, well, they were really assigned these different experiences because they were women, not because of something about their previous experience or what they want to do. So we actually did an experiment where we asked hiring managers to assign, to indicate which of the set of activities should be given to Kenneth versus Catherine. And Kenneth and Catherine were identical in their resumes. The only difference was the name at the top. And what we found was that hiring managers thought that Kenneth should get more challenging experiences than Catherine. So it's not just something that is a correlational sort of phenomenon. It's not just that women are getting less challenged. It's that managers may be assigning less challenging developmental experiences to women than to men, thereby making women less eligible for and less appropriate for higher level positions. Because if you don't learn from your development, how can you move on? So protection can be dangerous, and we've shown this in other studies too. We brought students into the lab. I feel bad about this one. We brought them into the lab, and we told them to work on an assignment, and then we said, we created some language that reflected either a hostile form of sexism, sort of traditional sexism, or benevolent sexism. We said, oh, I don't want you to have to struggle too hard on this. Let me help you. Or we said, oh, I'll just do it for you. Basically, those were the two conditions. And we found, and there was also a control condition, and we found that when we treated our participants in the benevolently sexist way, but not in the traditionally sexist way, they performed worse on the test, which was like an SAT math test. So when we treat people as if they're incompetent, if we say, oh, let me just do it for you, they feel incompetent and they perform worse. We also showed in several studies that this same behavior is often elicited by pregnant women. So people want to help pregnant women. They are the epitome of womanhood. They are soon-to-be mothers, right? And so they are sort of the embodiment of traditional femininity. And one of our communal sort of reactions to that is wanting to help pregnant women. And it turns out that we did a longitudinal study where we measured pregnant women's beliefs in their own capability for work, their self-confidence or self-efficacy over the course of their pregnancies. Every week we asked them, how much help did you get? How much did people treat you in a benevolently sexist way? And how much did you believe in your own abilities? And there too we found that over the course of pregnancy, women's self-confidence decreased, and they're helping, the amount other people tried to help them, to protect them, was increased. And we found that on a week-to-week basis, the more women were protected, the worse they felt about their own abilities. And the less they wanted to come back to work after having the baby. So this help, which is from a seemingly positive place, and it comes from both men and women, can undermine women's beliefs in their own ability. So that's a problem. But I also want to talk about the ladders, those opportunities that may exist and what the social science has to say about what we can do as women. Now let me just stop for a moment and say, I'm sharing this evidence because I want you to be empowered. As women, as men, as allies to each other, I want you to know what the research says. But I also want to mention that I'm not endorsing the idea that women should necessarily be responsible for other people's biases and problems, right? So I don't want to put all of the onus onto the targets of discrimination to solve the problem. But I do want us all to be empowered with information. So that's where I'm coming from with this. So the first ladder, the first thing I am confident helps women's success is something that I would call walk the thin line. And what this comes from is research that shows very convincingly that on average, men are stereotyped as being high in competence and moderately high in warmth. So people think men are pretty good at what they do, and women, and they're not super nurturing or warm, but that's okay. Women, on the other hand, are on average are stereotyped as being higher in warmth, so they're seen as nurturing and communal and other-oriented, but lower in competence. They're seen as less competent. And in the workplace, most workplaces, what you want to be to succeed, you want other people to think you're competent. Women have to establish their competence to overcome those negative stereotypes. And there's a lot of research that has shown that people's beliefs about women's competence underlie their decisions, their favoring of men over women. Because if you believe at an unconscious or conscious level that women are less competent than men, then it would make no sense to hire a woman over a man for a competence-related task or position. One of the well-known researchers in this field, her name is Joan Williams. She talks about, she's coined a term that I like, it's called gender judo. I find that very appealing. So the basic idea for her is much like the idea of walking the thin line. Women need to be seen as competent, but they can't sacrifice the perceptions of warmth. Because what do we think of when we think of a highly competent woman? There's a word for that. And we can think of many ideas, many folks in the media who embody those stereotypes, right? So when we think of a highly competent woman, we don't necessarily have other positive ideas about her. So women, to truly be successful, must first establish their competence, but cannot sacrifice the perceptions of warmth. So in my own day-to-day life, when I'm thinking about wanting to get the next promotion, what do? I make sure that I am competent at whatever is required of me for my job, but I also mention these other aspects of my identity, things that I care about that are related to warmth. So the study that's most directly relevant to this is one done by Madeline Howman at NYU, and she was interested in understanding whether women who refer to another person in their life, a spouse, a child, some sort of interpersonal relationship, might benefit from perceptions of warmth. And she found that, basically, when women were applying for a job and were very competent, they were even more likely to be hired than a man if they were also very warm, if they talked about other important people in their lives. Interestingly, the same gender judo applies to negotiations. So you may have heard women don't negotiate as much as men. They do not initiate negotiations. Have you heard that? That is true. We do not. We are less likely to ask. There's clear evidence of that. We are also, when we ask, less likely to get it. Why? Because the act of asking for something, particularly monetary, is more masculine than feminine. And so when we ask for more money or a promotion or whatever it is that we think we deserve, we get more negative reactions than a man asking for the same things. However, if you gender judo it, or walk the thin line, and ask not just for a promotion or more salary or whatever it is you're asking for, but also ask in a way that emphasizes your femininity, your warmth, then you will be more successful. There will be a less negative reaction. People will be more responsive. And so people often ask, well, what does that look like? How do I ask for more money in a feminine way? There's the gender judo. So my best guess, in the way that they've actually studied this in negotiation experiments, is women who ask for something on behalf of someone else. So I really need more resources for my team. Sounds a lot better than I really need resources for me, especially when it's coming from a woman, but also when it's from a man. Another example might be to be more efficient and successful, I think my efficiency would be increased, and thus my contributions to the team would be enhanced if I were able to work from home 1 day a week. People like that a lot better than I'm going to work from home so that I can have more flexibility for my family, even if that's the reason. So the reasons we give and the attributions that other people can take away from those reasons can influence their decisions, including important outcomes like those of negotiation. So women can walk the thin line between warmth and competence and do the gender judo. Women can also speak up. There's some fascinating research on gendered communication. Deborah Tannen is a linguistic sociologist or a linguist who has quite literally observed the patterns of men and women's speech from childhood to adulthood and just focused on workplace interactions. And there's just so much to talk about. I feel like I have given a lecture just on that topic. But some of the things that I think are really important for women to know about are apologizing. Women are much more likely to apologize in a work context in particular than men. Women are also much more likely to qualify their ideas and questions. They're more likely to ask questions than men. I remember one time I was in a talk and one of my male colleagues qualified his statement. And what that looks like is someone who says, hey, you may have already thought of this, but, or this may be a dumb idea, but, and when my male colleague said that, I was surprised. It was contrary or contradictory to my stereotype of men. So when my male colleague enacted what I saw as a feminine behavior, I had a negative reaction to it. Women are much more likely to use those statements. We qualify our statements. We might actually make a statement into a question. So rather than saying, I'm gonna go do this, sometimes women say, I'm gonna go do this. And just that tone of voice or pattern of speech can influence how we perceive each other, right? In positive and negative ways. Another one of the interesting findings when it comes to patterns of speech is that evaluations of faculty members are more positive to the extent that they curse. And women are less likely to curse than men. So I guess the advice there would be women should curse more in their classes. I don't know about that. But there is an interesting dynamic that plays out in our patterns of speech and that can relate to outcomes that we care about. So for the advice that I give to my students is that to the extent that you can think through the style of communication, which is easier to do in writing, I think, than in oral communication. It's really hard to change your pattern of speech once you're an adult. We develop our patterns way early in life, and it's very difficult to change. But certainly in writing, we have clear opportunities to speak more directly and more confidently, or to write more directly and confidently, and with fewer qualifiers and more certainty in our writing. That's one of the ways we can convey our competence. I told you that women are excluded from networks, or at least are not essential to networks, and are not as connected to people in higher levels of leadership. So what do? We network. We talk to each other. There's amazing research showing the strength of even weak ties. What's a weak tie? Just someone you know. The original work on this was done with physical letters, and they wrote a letter, and they gave it to you, let's say, and they said, can you try to get this letter to this person, Joe Schmo in New York, and you can send it to whoever you think would be closest to that person. So you wouldn't have an address, you would just have Joe Schmo. And so you would say, well, I know Kenneth Cole in Nebraska, so I'll send it to him. And that's closer to New York than Houston. Not really, but anyway. And it turns out that it only took at the time, which was in the 60s, I think, it only took 6 hops, 6 people, 6 nodes between people. So that 7 degrees of separation thing is actually accurate. And it's shrinking because of the internet. So now we can connect to each other in just 3 or 4 jumps. And those ties, those weak ties, are the ones that tend to help us get jobs. It's not usually on average, the referral process typically brings in not our best friends, but people we know, our acquaintances. That's what often gets a job. So build those ties, external to your organization and internal to your organization. Become more central. That sounds easy, but I know it's not. How do you get people to come to you, right? If that's how we measure centrality, is people saying, I go to so-and-so for advice, or I go to so-and-so to get my work done. Put yourself out there to the extent that you're comfortable doing that, to the extent that that's important to you. You got to put yourself in places where things are happening so that people will come to you. We also have to challenge ourselves. So if we're not the ones if our bosses are handing out new tasks, we have to put ourselves up for those. We have to say, hey, I'm interested in that. Because otherwise what happens, if you recall, is that we get the less challenging experiences. And what that might look like is a boss who says, oh, Eden probably doesn't want to travel abroad because she's got 2 little kids, so I'm going to give it to Seth instead. And so that's the place of protective paternalism or benevolent sexism. That's where it's coming from, trying to look out for what they think I want. But they don't know what I want until I tell them. I have to tell them, I want that job. I want the promotion. What do I need to do to get there? And I'll do it. So we have to challenge ourselves. We have to make our own development, take ownership of it. Again, easy to say, hard to do. And at the same time, I also want you to know that there is evidence that women, I told you about the evidence that we're sometimes protected, but there's also times when we're put in precarious positions. So an example of this would be a company that is expected to fail, and that's when the female CEO gets appointed. Marissa Mayer is one example. There is some evidence of what the phenomenon there is called the glass cliff, that women are put into precarious positions at the top of the cliff and expected to fail. So watch out for the glass cliff. So in the end, and then I would love to take your questions and go into depth about any more of these topics. Women continue to encounter disadvantages in the workplace. We see the opportunities ahead of us, but we find these chutes that seem to limit our ability to get further in our organizations. We may be unheard, unseen, excluded, and somehow yet still protected from opportunities that we want. But women can be empowered to address these challenges. We can walk the thin line or do the gender judo. We can speak up, we can make our own networks, and we can challenge ourselves to do things that are outside of our comfort zone or that stretch us. So those things are all true, and the social science has established them clearly. But I also want to mention again the role of institutions as change agents. So we as individuals can make change, but we also need to change the institutions in which we work. And that's a whole nother talk I'd be happy to give another time. But there are certainly things that organizations can do, and certainly things that allies can do to support women. And I imagine that if you're in the room, you are an ally, and you have the power. And it's often much, much more effective for an ally to engage in behaviors that support a woman than it is for the woman to do it herself. So I gave you the example of the meeting when your peer gets unheard, when somebody takes credit for her idea or his idea, you can call that out. That's a behavior that an ally can do. But allies can do much more than that. If your friend gets an award, it's better for you to promote it than for her to, because that self-promotion is seen as negative for women. But when allies promote it for us, it's seen as positive. And allies often are the ones with more power. So researchers have studied the ways in which and the degree to which women advocating for female issues versus men advocating for women's issues are effective. And quite consistently, men are better advocates for women than women in terms of their effectiveness. The same is true, this isn't the basis of this talk, but the same is true for whites versus non-whites. So if in some experimental settings, white people who confronted a remark that was racist were more effective in reducing racism than when people of color were the ones doing the confrontation. There's lots of reasons why white people and men have more power, and so they might be taken more seriously because of that. It's also seen as less self-interested. So it's not that men so when women advocate for ourselves, we're seen as acting in self-interest. We are acting in self-interest. We are motivated by our self-interest. But if somebody else advocates for us, then it's perceived quite differently. So we need men in the conversations. We need each other to lift us all up.